Thanks for joining. I'm Ryan Berg. I'm on Samuel's computer. That's why his name is listed. Y'all hear me? We're good? Okay, great. So my name is Ryan Berg. I work at Avenues for Youth in Minneapolis. I run the Connect Host Home program. And you are here to hear about LGBT youth homelessness and how communities can show up for young folks who are experiencing housing instability and homelessness. A little bit about me. There we go. A little bit about me. I speak nationally about LGBTQ youth homelessness and the host home model. Avenues has the longest running host home program in the country. And we help communities all over the country build and design their own programs. We share our resources readily with anyone who is interested. I'm also the author of No House to Call My Home, Love, Family, and Other Transgressions, a book I wrote about my experiences working with LGBTQ youth in New York City. It came out in 2015. And really the impetus behind that was recognizing that there were just a lack of conversation, support, and services for queer and trans youth experiencing homelessness. And it was just an invisible crisis. There were no culturally competent services happening at the time. So I thought, we learn through stories, and let me share some stories in order to hopefully evoke some change. I'm also, like I mentioned, the program manager at Avenues. Been with Avenues 8 years as of 2 days ago. So I'm, thank you. Yeah, I'm excited to still be a part of an agency that I believe is really doing great work in centering racial and economic justice and ensuring that we're creating just practices and supports for youth and building community, which is a big part of this work as well. And I've been doing the work for a while. So I started the work in New York City and moved to the Twin Cities area in 2013 and have been working with Avenues ever since. A little bit about Avenues as an agency. So we partner with young folks who are experiencing housing instability and homelessness ages 16 to 24 within the metro area. And we're really partnering with them to achieve their dreams. So we're not prescribing anything around goals. It's all youth determined and driven. And we really are there to walk alongside them and support them in achieving what makes sense to them around housing, employment, education, holistic care as well. Avenues started in 1994, and it was started by a young woman who was experiencing housing instability and homelessness herself. She was 19 and said, there are a lack of youth-specific services, and youth were having to go into the adult system and having to navigate really unfriendly atmospheres and conditions. And this young person really recognized that there was a need for youth-specific services to address what would be developmentally appropriate responses for young folks. So she started Avenues. It was called Project Foundation at the time, and it was in the basement of a church initially, and we've grown into having a few programs. We have right now we have 4 programs. And 2 of them are brick and mortar shelters and transitional living spaces, one in North Minneapolis and one in Brooklyn Park. The Brooklyn Park one is the first of its kind in the suburbs. So historically, youth had to migrate into the cities in order to receive services and support. This was an opportunity for youth to stay within their community of origin, where they considered home, be around friends, be around family, be around school, work, and still receive some support, not having to migrate into unfamiliar territory and navigate unfamiliar streets where they're more vulnerable to exploitation. We also have a Young Families program. Young Families is an apartment program. So about 30% of youth experiencing homelessness are parents themselves. Within the youth services world, youth and their children can't live together. So this is an opportunity for youth to get in their own apartment, live with their child, or however they define family, and receive some parenting support and some independent living support, and really work at achieving their own goals and dreams. And then Connect is the program I run, and that's the last program that I will be talking quite a bit about today. So a little bit about the context of youth homelessness in the state of Minnesota. On any given night in Minnesota, there are around 6,000 youth experiencing housing instability and homelessness. That, as you may very well know, is not just an urban issue, it's a statewide issue. There are many youth experiencing housing instability in the suburbs and in rural areas and smaller towns throughout the state. Unfortunately, most of the supports and services are concentrated in the metro area. And so again, youth, having to access, having to leave where they know best to get some support. Oftentimes there'll be one social worker for a county and are overextended, overburdened, overworked, and don't have the resources to share. Many counties don't have shelters for youth and are struggling to figure out ways to support young folks and keep them housed when there are not brick and mortar spaces for youth. So host home is a model that could work really well in different areas and for different populations. Our program specifically is designed for LGBTQ youth, but I know of host home programs across the country that target different populations, general youth populations, sometimes folks with disabilities, sometimes folks with chronic and pervasive mental health issues. So there are different ways to tailor this model to meet the needs of the community in which you're working. So out of the 6,000 youth experiencing housing instability and homelessness in Minnesota, the vast majority of those young folks are having to fend for themselves. We have enough shelter and transitional living programs for just a small sliver of the youth that are in need of resources. So the vast majority of youth are savvy and making things work the best they can. That oftentimes is couch hopping, staying with friends, staying in places not meant for human habitation, and finding ways, to temporarily get their needs met. Oftentimes, those approaches are not sustainable and don't allow for them to work outside of just surviving, right? It's so hard to focus on your goals if your goal is education or employment or working on your mental health. Super hard to do that if you don't know where you're going to put your head down that night, or you don't know where your next meal is coming from. So we have to do a lot more. Our systems are doing what they can, but there's room for communities to step up and to do a lot more. Causes and underlying factors of what brings young people into experiencing housing instability and homelessness. We know that unsafe families or systems, so family conflict with a caregiver of some kind, you being kicked out of your home for who you are and how you identify oftentimes is a predictor. Coming from under-resourced communities. So we know that, if mom is working 3 jobs to keep the 1-bedroom apartment with 5 kids, there are great stressors in place there. And, it's easier to fall through the cracks if you're coming from a community that doesn't have a ton of resources. So having a safety net of some kind within your community is of great importance. Generational poverty is huge. So we know economic and racial justice are at the core of the work that we need to be doing to prevent and end youth homelessness. So generational poverty, family poverty is incredibly difficult to hoist out of and find your way into some stability. It is generational and a great predictor of homelessness. And we also know systems involved youth experience housing instability and homelessness at a greater rate than general population youth. So systems like foster care that are designed for the welfare of children oftentimes do the exact opposite for many youth. Not all youth, but many youth that I work with have had poor experiences with foster care, and many of them move out of foster care into homelessness. One statistic is that there are more youth who age out of foster care who have been diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder than veterans of war. So it is a particularly broken system for a lot of young folks, and they are not leaving there equipped to live in a stable environment. And then the mental well-being of families and individuals. I think the collateral consequence of racial and economic injustice can deeply impact, right, the emotional well-being and mental well-being of folks, and that can make living in a stable environment challenging, finding a stable environment, having the means to stay in a stable environment very challenging. So, there are folks that need to prioritize their mental health in a stable environment in order to move into stable living. So we know from the Williams Institute that around 40% of youth experiencing housing instability and homelessness nationwide identify as LGBTQ, and the vast majority of those young folks are youth of color. So we know in order to end youth homelessness, as I mentioned, we must have a commitment to racial and economic justice work. So what are the youth that are at greatest risk for homelessness? We know that lack of education, coming from poverty, and then identity and culture all play a big part. So youth that are BIPOC or have an 83% higher risk of reporting homelessness, queer and trans youth, 120% higher risk of experiencing homelessness, living under $24,000 a year as a household, 162% higher risk, and then education. So we're at an institution of higher learning. It's not accessible to all folks. We know that just creates horrible odds when it comes to housing. The national climate for queer and trans youth. These statistics come from the Trans Student Educational Resources group. So like I had mentioned, we know about 40% of youth experiencing housing instability and homelessness are queer and trans identified. We know that 42% of homeless agencies do not address LGBTQ youth issues despite these elevated rates of homelessness. So they're not prioritizing, right, the most vulnerable populations within the homeless youth world. We know that youth are leaving home earlier and earlier. So there's the average age of a young person who identifies as lesbian or gay in New York left home and became homeless at age 14 and a half. And trans youth in New York, 13 and a half. 68% of homeless LGBTQ youth have experienced family rejection. And 54% have experienced some kind of family abuse. I think it's incredibly important to point out that family rejection is a very difficult and real and painful truth for a lot of young folks, but it's not the full picture. As we saw in the last slide, there's often an intersection of how one identifies and the experiences that one has that can lead to housing instability and homelessness. And so it's important to look at the whole picture, right? And look at how, if mom is working 3 jobs, has a 1-bedroom apartment, has 4 kids, dad's been deported, maybe your oldest kid coming out is going to be, the stressor, right? That you don't have the emotional bandwidth to address and to be present for that young person. So there are confounding issues at play. Ooh, the lights just went up. There are confounding issues at play that we need to address, and we need to be able to look at the whole. Thank you, Samuel. Look at the whole picture in order to ensure that we're not creating a hierarchy of who deserves support and who doesn't. I think it's super important to create affirming spaces where youth can bring their whole selves and not have to censor aspects of who they are in order to get their needs met. I think some of these statistics aren't a surprise. It is more costly to incarcerate folks. So oftentimes, experiencing homelessness can lead to, surviving on the streets can be criminalized quite easily. And so and oftentimes youth will be funneled into the criminal justice system. So it's incredibly important to look at alternatives to that. Some people want to look at money as a motivating force. So it's more cost effective to actually house young folks, provide them the resources and support, holistic supports, than it is to actually incarcerate them. And so we take all of this into consideration, and we're looking at, a sizable chunk of shelters reporting that despite all of these facts, despite all of this research, that helping LGBTQ youth is not a central part of their mission. So not focusing in on, again, those who are most marginalized and need support in the ways that would be helpful and useful and affirming to them. I'd mentioned a little bit about adversity that young people experience. So back in 1997, Kaiser Permanente and CDC did their first study of adverse childhood experiences. Some of you may know as ACEs. And it's first of its kind study. It's been changed and kind of expanded upon over the years. We know in the state of Minnesota, out of a Wilder research report that just came out this year, that 90% of youth respondents to a survey around youth homelessness, 90% of LGBTQ youth had experienced at least one ACE, and 70% had experienced 3 or more. And we know that there's correlation to experiencing childhood adversity and long-term chronic illness and a variety of emotional, mental, and developmental issues as well. So we know that LGBTQ youth have endured especially high levels of adversity among youth who experience housing instability and homelessness. This slide is showing you the disparity between cisgender and straight peers versus queer and trans peers. So overrepresentation in every category. So it's exchanging sex for basic needs, for being forced into having sex, physical harm by others, harming oneself, exposed to discrimination and stigma within the family and outside of the family. So in every category, youth are experiencing higher rates of adversity. And then that stigma correlates to mental health outcomes as well, right? So we know that in the state of Minnesota from that Wilder research report that came out this year that LGBTQ youth have higher rates of struggling with mental health than their straight and cisgender peers. And that's completely tied to the stigma, discrimination and violence they experience based off of who they are. I'd mentioned some of the supports from Avenues. We work with 300 young people a year. These are some of the programs that I mentioned to you earlier. And then a little bit about Connect. So I'm here to really talk about community supports, right? So I explained kind of like the context of youth homelessness, some of the predictors of youth homelessness, and that systems don't have the means or capacity to support the vast majority of young folks. So something that happened back in '97 was the LGBTQ community came together and recognized that there was this overrepresentation of LGBTQ youth within youth shelter. A lot of youth reporting that they would prefer to sleep on the streets than actually utilize those shelters because of the discrimination they experienced in those shelters and the violence. And the community came together and said, well, what can we do? What can we do to support our young folks? And they did a feasibility study and recognized that host home could be a potential fit. Host home is simple by design, right? In theory, it's very simple. There are some folks with resources and there are some folks in need of resources, and let's connect them. It's a mutual aid model, essentially. So there are folks in the community who open up their homes, provide food and shelter, and then Avenues provides wraparound services and support. We work with youth ages 16 to 24, and we function both as emergency shelter and transitional living. So emergency shelter is 1 day to 3 months. Transitional living is around a year. So the program is flexible and can meet the needs of youth both in an emergency shelter situation or in more of a kind of a transitional living situation. So why host homes? It's transitional living, it's safer, it's community built, and it's non-institutional. So we work completely outside of the system. We don't take government funding. We don't license our homes. And these are all intentional reasons. So we are trying to meet the needs of the youth and the hosts in the moment. And we're not trying to create barriers in order to get those needs met. So I'm not interested in an egress window. I'm interested in if a young person feels safe and affirmed in the environment that they're staying. That to me is the utmost importance. So we're like I said, we're not trying to get in the way of creating safer spaces and building relationship. Cost effective. Brick and mortar spaces are incredibly costly and costly to build, design, costly to maintain and operate, and to keep folks employed in. So we are a community-based program. That brick and mortar aspect is a great benefit from the hosts, right? We have that built into the design of the program where it's community-based. And then I think one of the most important things, the intangibles and the icing on the cake, is the long-term, lifelong relationships that can be established in this context. The ask of hosts is food and shelter, but we know relationship is at the core of healing. Relationship is not an expectation of the program. We don't put that burden onto the young folks. So many young folks have been failed by adults time and time again. So there isn't that expectation, but we create room for relationship to grow and build, and trust to grow and build. So we ask our hosts to provide food and shelter and to be caring and consistent in order for that opportunity of relationship to build and grow. But like I said, again, it's not an expectation, so youth don't feel like they need to engage with these hosts in this manner in order to get their needs met. But what we have seen is relationship does grow. And young people are often looking for ways to attach in healthy ways and build connection and to be affirmed. And oftentimes through our training, where youth are not experiencing a non-judgmental approach, they're able to engage with hosts in that way. And sorry, people just walked in. And that can be life-changing. It can be absolutely life-changing. So it's not just changing the lives of youth, but also hosts as well. And by extension, it's changing the community. It's reciprocal. Sometimes hosts will come in thinking, I'm doing this in order to change the life of a young person, but finding that really this is not about saviors. This is about showing up in ways and walking alongside a young person for a season, and then creating, like I said, that space for that relationship to manifest. So a little bit about our basic operations. Like I mentioned, we function completely outside of the system. And we recruit, screen, and train and support community volunteers who provide the housing and food for young folks who are precariously housed. I'm the program manager, so I do that recruitment, screening, and training of hosts. And then I'm the main support and advocate for the hosts. And then youth are referred by many partners throughout the community. They can self-refer homeless youth agencies, school social workers, homeless liaisons, county social workers, community advocates, priests. Anyone can really kind of make that leap and call and say that they'd like to refer a young person. And then we have a youth advocate who is the main support for the youth. We do that separation so youth feel like they have that one advocate in their corner. And then the hosts have someone to kind of process their challenging times with as well. So that ongoing case management is very intensive and consistent. And it again is rooted in relationship. So it's not about checking off a list of skills that youth need to show competency in. It's about how do we build trust between us so youth can define their goals, and then we can help them meet those particular goals. Some of the key features of the work that we do. So I have an action council who is really instrumental in helping with the recruitment piece. So these are folks that are in the community. They're activists and organizers primarily. I'm not looking for other social service providers necessarily. I'm open to it, but it's not like it's not a prerequisite. And that's because we're really trying to find folks who reflect the community in which we work, and are working at building community in their own way. So maybe they're centering racial and economic justice work and they're organizing. How can we partner together and find ways to get more hosts? So like it's key to host recruitment and promoting the program. We're small by design, so we need all the folks we can get to get folks out there to share the word about the program. And then they really are helping and maintain the integrity intent of the program. So they're really challenging me in order to stay true to the mission of the program. And then we have our values and understandings of host home, which I'll get to a little bit later. Some of the key features of the program is our host recruitment and screening. So it's really a form of community organizing and relationship building. So I'm out in the community. Pre-COVID, I was out in the community quite a bit more, and really engaging the community in ways in which I could share about the work we do and the importance of hosting within the community, building those relationships as much as possible. For folks that are interested in becoming hosts, there's an application form that folks fill out, background checks. We do an interview before training and an interview after, and then we have reference letters that we get from the community as well. And then we do 16 hours of training. These are all around the context of youth homelessness. We do training around positive youth development, trauma and resiliency. We bring in a panel of hosts to talk about their experience. And then the second day, it's really turning the lens inward. Why am I showing up to do this? Why do I want to do this? So values, expectations, boundaries, assumptions, really bringing the unconscious to the conscious as much as possible. How does anger show up on my body? How can I learn to narrate my emotion so a young person doesn't feel like, if I walk into the house and I've had a bad day at work and I throw my bag down and when I get angry, I'm kind of tight-lipped and quiet and don't make eye contact. How do we ensure that the youth isn't making assumptions around how that's tied to them? So narrating our emotion around that connection. And then, we live in Minnesota with some of the worst racial disparities in the country. Because of that, those who have access to the resources to actually open their home and share are oftentimes white, and those who are working with who need some support are oftentimes BIPOC. So how are we minimizing that misuse of power and privilege? And how are we addressing whiteness in those moments? And there's an inherent power dynamic that's an imbalance within the context of hosting. How are we minimizing that misuse in order to ensure everyone feels supported and affirmed? And then we do a trans 101, so gender and trans identity as well. A lot of LGBT folks are not T competent, so trying to find ways to ensure that everyone is going to be creating that affirming space for youth. And then really about looking at self-reflection exercises, power and privilege awareness. It's ongoing work as we go on. So it's not just this one-time training up front, but we incorporate that training throughout the host experience with the program. And then lastly, we bring in a panel of youth and they talk about their experience, the good, bad, and ugly. They're very competent at sharing what has not worked for them and what has, and we are appreciative of that because we're always striving to do better. So some of the key features of the program, everything is youth determined and driven. Oftentimes folks will ask how host home is different than foster care. About 30 to 40% of youth who are experiencing homelessness have been systems involved in some manner in their lives, and they've had two major complaints. One, I had no say in where I got to stay. So youth oftentimes don't get to meet foster parents in foster care prior to living with them. So there's no sense of like what the environment is like. Do our values align? Do we have shared interests? None of that is available to the young person to know. And then secondly, youth complain about in foster care that they feel like foster parents are padding their pockets to care for them. So within our process, we flip that script. Youth get to read the applications of hosts. Hosts don't read the applications of youth. All hosts write an open letter to young people explaining who they are, why they want to be a part of this program, what their environment is like, what their culture is like, what are their interests. Youth get to read those letters and then determine if they'd actually like to meet that person to potentially live with down the line. It gives a sense of agency to the young person, so they don't feel like they're a cog in a wheel, but they actually are an active participant in their own lives. And that is transformational for a lot of young folks. And then secondly, it's a volunteer program. So youth don't feel like their pockets are being padded in order to care for them. That does have its own set of complications. Like I mentioned before, we're in the state of Minnesota, with some of the worst racial disparities in the country. So who does that leave out from potentially hosting if they would like to or choose to? And so we are mindful of that, and we do our work to ensure that there are multiple ways of engaging with the host home program. We know that there are many youth who are informally being hosted across the country and across the state and in different communities. How are we able to show up for them? So if folks do want to be a part of the program, if there are a youth or an informal host who, they're just like, we want to keep this young person in our home for the time being, but we just don't know how to help them get to the next step, they can back into the program if they choose to. And then also, if we don't have any hosts available, we do something called community circle. So who's in your community that you would like to potentially live with, and would you like me to reach out to them and talk about the program a bit? And there's consistent support for both youth and hosts. We meet weekly. I meet weekly with the hosts, and then Maya, who's the case manager, the youth advocate engagement specialist, meets weekly with the youth, and then we all come together for home visits as well. Careful youth referrals, so folks who are referring youth in, we're very intentional about ensuring that the youth is going to be a good fit for the program. So that's meaning, a youth can have chronic and pervasive mental health issues, but are they being addressed? Is there support in place? Is there a therapist? Is there a treatment team? Substance use and misuse youth can come into the program, but are they getting support around that? Are we using harm reduction model in order to provide some care and support and resource? Or are they interested in becoming a part of a treatment team? So we need to ensure that those pieces are in place prior to moving into host home, because our hosts are not social workers. And so the case manager works with the youth for a month prior to them being referred into the program. Like I mentioned, everything is really kind of centered around relationship. So that allows kind of the harder questions that you would typically see in like an intake form to be folded into conversation rather than just a checklist. So the opportunity to kind of go deeper into those questions, kind of manifests through that approach. And then this is, it's a voluntary program. So youth have to want to be a part of it, and youth are never placed. We match young people. Like I mentioned, it's youth determined and driven. So we're never placing a young person into a home, or rather we're matching them, and they're guiding the process. And then when youth calls and they don't have a case manager, that they're receiving case management, and that we're getting a proper assessment. Youth can still work with Maya regardless of becoming a part of the host home program or not. So Maya will work with young people to meet their other housing goals if host home doesn't fit their needs or they're not a good match for the program. So it's not like youth comes in, gets assessed, isn't a good fit, and then we disappear. We stay with young folks for as long as they need. And that is also the case for after youth move out. Maya can work with them in an aftercare component for as long as they need as well. Some key features. So ongoing host training and support for the program. We do a monthly host home community network where the first Saturday of every month, hosts can come together and really kind of talk through the challenges, the successes, problem solve together as much as they need. And then every third host home community network is a deeper dive training. So maybe it's a deeper dive again into whiteness, or maybe harm reduction or trauma-informed care is a challenging concept. So we'll bring in a facilitator to do a deeper dive and kind of get more nuanced in those areas. I'm available to hosts as needed through calls and meetings. Like I mentioned, we do the host home community network. And then we do those home visits, monthly meetings in the home where we all get together And we're really trying to be as strengths-based as possible. A lot of youth, feel like, oh, this is about adults telling me what I'm doing wrong. This is about what's working well and how can we best support that. And if there are challenges, how can we address them as a team through a restorative justice model where we all have a voice in coming up with a solution. I do trainings for hosts 2 to 3 times a year. A lot of that has moved online due to COVID. Hopefully we'll be getting back into person soon. But yeah, I do 2 to 3 trainings. There's small cohorts of folks typically. So people feel like we're creating space for them to have challenging and difficult and honest conversations. And they feel, that there won't be judgment in those moments, but it's really about kind of unpacking, our belief systems and the way we've been conditioned and kind of pushing against that a bit and learning ways to kind of support not only youth, but ourselves in those moments where we really are doing our internal work. So we're not putting our emotional stuff onto a young person, but we're cultivating the skills and the tools to address our own needs through community support or through support through the program. Social events, we used to do something called Queers on Wheels, where we rented out a roller rink. That roller rink has since closed down, so we can't do that anymore, but we're always trying to find ways to engage community and build up that community aspect. And then just ongoing support, right, by our case manager. So we are small by design. We work with 10 young people at a time. And that's intentional because we want to be able to center that relationship, have time to build those relationships, foster that connection as much as possible. And we can't do that if we have 70 youth on our caseloads. So we are small by design in order to build those relationships. And we also see how that affects outcomes. So many programs that work with young people, about 50 to 60% of them, of those young people that exit out move into stable housing. With Connect, the number is 90 to 100% annually where youth move into stable housing. So we're working really hard, like I mentioned, to meet youth where they're at, and that's both emotionally and physically. And it's intensive support, both for hosts and youth, and it's flexible. So, I am able to address needs of youth and hosts in the moment as needed, and providing whatever flexible kind of support that is needed. So we aren't a 9-to-5 kind of job. We are, if a home visit needs to happen at 9 p.m., it happens at 9 p.m. if that's the only time people can get together. So really trying to show up in ways that make sense to the community and to the young folks. Something that we talk about a lot in Connect and in our community is intent versus impact. A lot of hosts come in with wonderful intent and oftentimes are unaware of the impact of actions. Oftentimes it's through the lens of whiteness. And so being really cognizant of how we're showing up. I think it's very common for folks to want to be judged by their intent, but judge others by the impact of their actions. So how are we showing up in ways that are gentle with one another, but also holding ourselves accountable in moments that are challenging, recognizing when we're triggered, and how do we respond in a way that's not a reaction, not reactive, but really a response. So it's important that we're constantly looking at the impact of power and privilege in the host home environment. I talked about this a little bit, but scalability. People often ask me, if your success rates of exiting youth is so high, why not scale up? And I think part of the success rate is because we are small by design. We're able to build that community and relationship with young folks. So ideally, we would have 20 hosts, 20 host homes. 10 would be active and 10 would be inactive. Unfortunately, because of COVID, we did lose quite a few host homes. As you can imagine, it was really challenging to try to match youth and hosts, a community-based program in the midst of a global pandemic. So we had to kind of put things on hold for a while. We're building back up again. We have folks that are interested again, which is great. People are hearing about the program, which is great. And we're building up that host pool again, so we'll be able to meet the needs of young folks as they come in. People ask about the evaluation of our program and what we're looking for outcomes. So annually, I'm looking to build an additional 5 host homes into the program. So that's training 5 new host homes, so we can support 10 young people at a time. An outcome that we're always looking for is that youth transition into stable housing at about 75%. Like I mentioned, it's been closer to 90 to 100% the past few years, which is fantastic. And then 75% of those young folks maintain stable housing a year after during our follow-up. And we're looking at about 80% right now for that. And then in addition, we are looking to help communities across the country build their own host home programs. So we consult and help folks, like I mentioned, in a lot of under-resourced communities, smaller communities, rural communities. Shelter isn't an option. It's just there isn't the money for it. So how can we show up with a program like host home in these communities so youth have a safer space to go? And then we seek to end homelessness through prevention strategies, as community engagement and social justice advocacy. We're always talking about how do we bridge the gap between social service and social justice. This is a leap of faith for everyone. It's with host home, it's living in the gray. There's not a lot of black and white rules. Rocky, who was my predecessor, used to say, all relationships have the potential to be both messy and magical. And that is definitely the case in host home. This is a challenging and difficult endeavor for folks to jump into. It's important to manage expectations around what success may look like or what you feel success should look like. We can guarantee that there are going to be conflicts and there will be some difficult times. And hosts can't expect youth to feel grateful to be living in a program for housing instability and homelessness. And hosts will always want to know more about a young person than what they do. We share pertinent information with hosts prior to move-in. We do a series of meet and greets with hosts and youth so they get to know each other. And that's it. We don't hand over a dossier of a young person's life or a case file of a young person's existence. We are getting to know folks in real time in the moment. And like I said, sharing pertinent information that hosts would need to know, but not exploring history or past that may just be around curiosity. It's really about let's create an opportunity to get to know each other and build connection authentically and not by reading someone's case file. My job is really to help set some clear boundaries and to recognize issues and triggers. And part of the host work is to do their own self-work. And so talking to hosts about what that means for them. Is that going to therapy? Is that how do you manage your stress and your anxiety? How are you ensuring you're not putting your emotional baggage onto the young person or your own emotional insecurities on the young person? How are you showing up for yourself in this way? How are you filling your cup in this way? And so that's a constant conversation I have with folks. And then constantly talking about assumptions and power and privilege, and especially having those conversations with our white middle class hosts. It's about communicating, training, being supportive, listening, challenging, and repeating. So some of the lessons learned through this journey of doing host home since 1997. It must be created and owned by the community. Can't be just another social service program. And we have a bias against government funding, like I mentioned before. We don't want the program to become rules-based and institutional. It has to be rooted in relationship. It has to be rooted in community. And good case management is crucial. So initially when we started, we relied on referring agencies to provide the case management for the young folks. And there just was a lack of capacity with a lot of case managers, a lot of consistency with different case managers providing different supports. And so that led us to create a role where we had our own youth engagement specialist, Maya, who's the case manager. So there is that consistency and there is that kind of level of understanding shared values under the umbrella of one agency, which is incredibly important. And like I mentioned many times, we must question our role and commitment to social justice. Some of our values, and the wheel talks about some of the supports we have. But yeah, some of the values are around seeking to recognize and challenge systems of power that perpetuate barriers and injustice in young people's lives. And then we recognize and respect the intersectionality of identities, which I've talked about before. We want youth and community to bring their whole selves to the experience and not have to censor aspects of who they are. And we believe that youth benefit from living with adult allies who are aware of the inherent power dynamics of the host home model and strive to minimize that misuse of power. So Samuel, would you mind helping me with the video? I'm going to show you a short video.
I was so
Do you mind if it's small? You want it?
No, it's fine. It's fine. It's fine.
I was so nervous. I was so freaking nervous. Like, I couldn't sleep for a couple of days. I didn't go for it just yet. I didn't move in with them. And I had to get to know my host a little bit more before I decided to move in.
Having someone come into your home, into your space, you know, interesting similar fears that maybe a youth would have too of how's this gonna work? I still remember the first day that Ken came over. And one of the things for us is with these two dogs that we have in our life. And I remember Ken first walked in the door, sat on the floor, and both of them would not stop licking him.
It's like, I was really surprised that Steve was a music teacher. I was really excited about that.
Over time, I felt like we could give advice and be sort of an older mentor or friend.
Growing up, my family has always been through homelessness and we've had to couch hop, but it was usually between family and family friends. So moving into a stranger's home was brand new territory for me.
It's one thing to be able to give money, give funding, which we do and I completely support. And it's one thing to go the next step and actually do the work and actually open yourself up in your home to another person.
I really didn't see myself as being homeless until I got into the shelter and I had to experience some kind of bullying because of it.
We had it pretty easy when we came out. I maybe lost one conservative Christian friend, but I didn't lose family or friends, get kicked out.
I know what the privilege I have. I have not been homeless. I can't imagine what that's like, so I'll never be able to fully understand it, but how can I give back to youth in a way that I know is worthwhile?
A lot of youth are youth of color, and we are already born in a place of instability.
It's hard. It's a hard question, how to convince others that they should care about others besides just themselves. But I think that they should. It makes us better humans. It makes this world a better place for everyone.
When you're hosting youth, you're helping them directly, and you're making an even bigger impact by changing their life.
Empathy is a basic part of being human, and I think if we lose that, we're really going down a bad road.
If you continue to just educate yourself, that's one step. Donating money, that's another step. Going for it and being active and helping others and changing their lives, that's a really big step. It's all gonna be a domino effect to where more people wanna help, more youth will get involved, and that's when the real change starts.
All right. Yeah, so I think that that video does a great job of demonstrating, you know, from a youth and host perspective, the common fears and challenges and opportunity for connection, which I think can be a really beautiful thing. So yeah, that's what I have for y'all. If you have any questions, I'm happy to answer, or Yes, please, Karen.
Hi, I'm Karen Anderson. I'm in the Community Engagement Office. And it looks like we don't have a lot of people in on the call, and that's okay because I'm hoping you can give me some clues about something that I can use for a program we're hosting. On December 19th, not December, November 19th, I don't want to rush the month. November 19th to 20th, we have our Homeless Awareness Sleep Out. And as a part of that, we do a lot of different things. One of which is we sleep out in our cars in the parking lot here on campus. Some people think we should be sleeping in cardboard boxes in the forest. I'm like, no, that's when you go from homed to homeless, you typically don't go straight to the forest with a box. So we're sleeping in our cars. And the goal is to really put ourselves in that situation where we might find ourselves if we were homeless, or to understand what other people are going through if they're homeless. We have some scenarios that we go through as part of the evening progresses. We take a jar or envelope of scenarios and everybody draws one. And then they have 20 minutes in their car that they have to do it. It may be you only have enough fuel in your car to stay warm overnight or to get to your job in the morning. Or it may be that you live in your car, so you live in your car. Your car is so filled with boxes that you don't have any place to move around. So we do this drawing, and I realize we don't have the LGBT community really represented in this drawing for scenarios. Is there a typical scenario of a homeless youth that might be good for a scenario that I could use in this experience? And if you don't want to answer that here in front of everybody, that's okay. But if there's something that you'd want to share with me offline, you can send it to me. Or if you want to share here, that's fine too.
That's a great question. Honestly, I would have to think on it for a second. But my email is listed right there. So if you wanted to reach out to me and remind me, and I will respond to you when I get back into the office. Just give me some time to kind of ponder it a little bit.
Sounds great.
But I'd be happy to chat with you about that.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Anyone else? Any questions, thoughts, insights, curiosities about the program, about the work I do? Happy to answer any questions. No? Yes, Gary.
Not a question, but I really, really, truly want to thank you for the work that you do. It's so valuable. And I would imagine that seeing the growth that goes through the changes in community, the healing that you help with is just as important as pay. But if nobody's told you lately, thank you for what you do.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Yeah, I just did a youth session prior to this, and I was talking to someone who was asking about outcomes and results. And I think one thing that I learned early on doing this work is it's really about planting a seed. I might not see the benefits of the connection and relationship. That might not kind of latch on until later when the young person is developmentally in a place where they can utilize those what they gleaned from whatever relationship we have. So I think that's an important aspect. But I appreciate your comment, and yeah, I mean, it's bearing witness to relationship where, like, watching hosts and youth grow together. It's in having this transformational shift for a young person where they know they have someone that they can turn to. They know that there is someone who's validating who they are. There's someone who wants to know about their day and genuinely cares for them as a human being. Watching that happen is pretty mind blowing, and it definitely is one of the greatest benefits of doing this kind of work. So I appreciate your comment. Anyone else on the call have a comment or question? Well, I do appreciate you all taking some time out of your afternoon to learn a little bit more about host homes. I did talk to David from the LGBT Center around, if Mankato has any interest in learning about how to kind of develop its own host home program. I'm happy to come and talk to folks more about the nuts and bolts of the program and how to get up and running if that is of need to this community. But yeah, thank you for your time, and I hope you all have a fantastic afternoon.